Welcome and welcome back to A House Divided. We are coming to you today, as we always do, from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I am the administrator for this event. I will introduce you to our host in just a moment. The book we are talking about today is, or our guest today is Derf Backderf from Ohio. Thank you very much for joining us virtually today. And the book we will be discussing is Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio, published by Abrams Comic Arts, published in 2020, 279 pages. You can order, if you're watching this live on our Facebook stream, you can order the book by going to a link that I'm going to put in the comments here in just a second. But if you're watching this later on our YouTube channel, you can find a link to the comments in the description there. And if you just want to know where to go, it's alincolnbookshop.com and find Kent State anywhere there. There'll be an order form. You'll be able to order up a first edition copy of Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio with a custom signed book plate. Mr. Backderf was generous enough to sign these for us, and we thank him for doing that. Like I may have mentioned before, I have found out today that first editions of this book are getting quite scarce. And most people that watch A House Divided are antiquarians or bibliophiles or whatever you might want to call it, but they like first editions. They like the first printing of the first edition, and that's what we have available for you today. So order it up. We will give you a signed book plate and we will ship it out to you. If you have questions for the author, we want to share those questions with him. So put them in the comments section of the Facebook feed. And you know where to find that because you're on Facebook right now. I will probably jump in here in a few minutes and ask a few questions from you. And with no further business on my part, I wish to turn this conversation over to your host, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Thanks, Bjorn. And Derf, thank you for joining us. Wish you were in the studio. Eventually, if this Pfizer vaccine or another one comes by, we'll get you back in for your next book, whatever that's going to be. You don't know either, I think, at this point.
No.
So, Derf Backderf is an American cartoonist. His comic strip, The City, appeared in a number of alternative newspapers from 1990 to 2014, including right here in Chicago at The Reader. He's won over 50 awards for his newspaper work, including the prestigious Bronze Medal from the Society of Newspaper Design. In 2006, he won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for political cartooning, the Inkpot Award 2016, Eisner Award, the Oscar of the comic book world, and he's contributed to many well-known national publications, including Playboy, the Wall Street Journal, and the Progressive, and others. His work has been displayed in galleries and museums, and he's most well known for his graphic novels. He's the author of Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, My Friend Dahmer. You may have to help me this on Derf, how the prize is pronounced.
Angoulême.
Yeah, the Angoulême Prize, and also Trashed. Thank you for that.
Sure.
His latest book, the one that we have him here today for, is Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio. It's an Abrams Comic Art, and as Bjorn said, he said 279 pages, but I think it's 280. There was an epilogue put at the end, and we'll get to that at the end. It's $24, and this is your time. You'll get a signed book plate, one of our special book plates designed by Carl Sandburg, at least our logo, and we'll have that in, and it will be a first edition as long as they last. But we've just been told by Derf that it's going into second edition shortly. Now, it seems like your books, Derf, follow your life. I mean, you worked garbage trucks. Mm-hmm. You were a schoolmaker, Jeffrey Dahmer. You lived 20 miles from Kent State. You saw the National Guardsmen in your area just the night before this book begins. the Teamsters strike versus cabs on April 30th of 1970. So these books are really a part of you.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
as a cartoonist, how did you begin your cartoon career? Who were your mentors?
Mentors. Wow.
Who did you
Well,
look at?
well, probably first, newspaper comics like Peanuts, and then Mad Magazine, of course, like everyone else of about a 50-year period of comics creators. And then in college, I began to get published as a political cartoonist. I can't even tell you why I decided to do political cartoons. I think it was just an opportunity. And I had some mentors there. The founding curator of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Museum, for example, was a professor of mine, and some journalism profs. So, I mean, it was, but comics creators, I think, mostly are kind of self-born. We
And
we do it
self-taught
because
as an illustrator.
we must. I mean, it's just some
Yeah.
bizarre compulsion.
What's your approach to now? You started out as a cartoonist. What's your approach to the graphic novel as a writer? How did it grow out of the cartoon into writing a novel? What's your experience with that?
Well, at the end of the 90s, all through the 90s, I've been doing that comic strip and had a lot of success with it. I think I was in, I don't know, 75, 80 papers, and was making a decent living. But at the end of the 90s, I could see the industry starting to wobble, particularly because of the pressures of the internet. And I just thought, this really isn't good. This isn't a good trend. So at that point, I was pretty much out of genres, and graphic novels were starting to really surge at that time. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Maybe I'll give this a try. And my early experiments with longer form storytelling were promising enough that I just kept going with it. And of course, it turns out I'm much better at graphic novels and long form narrative than I was at anything else I've ever done. So I basically wasted 25 years of my career, but that's how it goes sometimes.
Well, your illustrations, you've been compared to Robert Crumb, not surprisingly. Personally, I compare you to, as I was going through it, I compared that to the writings of journalist Mike Royko, but in art.
Huh,
I found you more like Royko.
that's a new
Bold,
one.
brash, down to
Yeah.
earth, working class, emotional, straightforward, powerful. So that's whom I compare you to.
Well,
But Crumb
that's
is not
heady
a bad
praise. Thank
choice
you.
either.
Yeah, that's heady
Now,
praise. Yeah, I
I don't
think the
want to
crumb
bear it.
the crumb thing I think is way off. I mean, I never even read a lot of crumb. I think people that tend to use that don't really have a large knowledge of comics history, because Crumb is the only underground or alternative cartoonist they know. But actually, one of my inspirations, more accurately, would be Spain Rodriguez, who was also a fellow Zap cartoonist, but whose work is much more expressive and much more gritty and urban than Crumb's ever was. And I think I'm closer to that. And then whatever I've developed over the years, I mean, at this point, I think my influences are pretty far in the rearview mirror. Whatever's there on the
Yeah,
page is me.
it's you.
Yeah.
Well, it's a graphic novel, and we need to show some of this. And I don't want to bury the lead. Before the show, you were telling us that your publisher didn't want to bury the lead either, and put on Four Dead in Ohio, and you didn't want that up there. But here is an idea of what your illustrations look like. Here's one with the guardsmen firing.
Yeah, the iconic moment.
And here, pretty graphic again, one of the students shot. But it's powerful. And as you're reading along and you get to that part, even though some of us know what's going to happen, it's still very powerful when we see it.
Yeah,
And you
packs
get
a
it.
wallop. Well, that's the first time, that's the first time those images have existed, because, we have the very famous photos of the carnage afterwards, but the actual shootings themselves, no, we don't have any photos from there, because the photographers very wisely hit the dirt when the bullets started flying, because one of the kids who was shot was taking pictures.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's the power of comics, that I can conjure up those images based on research, based on morgue reports, based on hospital reports, medical records, all that stuff, eyewitness accounts, and actually show that horrible moment when the bullets start to fly. And I think that was, I never hesitated on that. I thought it was very crucial to do that, because
You have to
the
agree.
reader needs to understand just just what a horrific act of violence this was, that these guardsmen shot into a parking lot full of students, most of whom had books in their hands. And you need
Well,
to
most of
show
them,
that to
if they see anything, this is what they're going to see.
a, right. Yeah, that's the
This
moment
is the
after.
iconic piece.
Right, the moment after. Yeah.
And this is
Very,
the back of your dust jacket.
right, right, right.
What I also like, by the way, are the covers. You don't waste any space on a graphic
Mhm.
novel. So here's the front board underneath the dust jacket.
Right.
So remove the dust jacket to save it when you read. And then you'll also have these wonderful, powerful illustrations to look at as well.
Abrams makes
Um,
beautiful books. That's the one of the things I like about them most. I mean, they really do put together a nice package.
Yeah, positively. It's striking,
Thanks.
actually. And of course, the darker colors have make that happen as well. Let me ask you about your research. You just alluded to it. Um, you give a shout out to Chris Butler,
Mm-hmm.
Kent State itself, their archives, their oral histories,
Yep.
firsthand accounts,
Mm-hmm.
the living participants. Who were you able to talk to? Who were you not able to talk to? Did any of
Well,
the guardsmen open up?
no. I mean, I had the account, a very detailed account of one of the guardsmen. I had another guardsman who I know, who I was able to coax a little color out of, you know, just details here and there. He was not a shooter, but he was there on campus. Yeah, I was able to get close to a lot of people. I mean, there were 21,000 students on that campus in 1970, so there were a lot of people there and a lot of people connected to this. Some people didn't want to talk. Some people have never talked. Some people have not talked in years. They talked at first. They don't want to talk now. I mean, it was really a mixed bag. Um, and there were a lot of already existing accounts out there from those people earlier when they were talking. So it was just a matter of just doing the footwork and tracking it down. There were a few that, yeah, I couldn't get, and that was frustrating. But there are some that I talked to who have never spoken before. So that's the benefit also of being a local boy, because, a lot of these people still live in the area, and I knew friends of friends, and so was able to gain access that way, get an introduction. I mean, it was a very painstaking process.
Of course, it's called a graphic novel, but it's really also a serious documentary.
Hmm.
Excellent notes throughout and at the end,
Thanks.
representations from different people. There's even you at the beginning. How would you describe your perspective as the author? What is your voice here?
Um, well, I'm certainly present in the narration. This is definitely a book with an opinion, as most of my books are. But I try to be fair and measured, and at least offer the perspective of the guard. I mean, obviously my alliances lay with the victims, and there's no doubt there. But I mean, I show what the guard went through as well, and in some ways they were victimized as well by the politicians and their incompetent leaders. I mean, those were the real villains.
That comes
Um,
through here. That
yeah.
the guardsmen are there too, and they were very young. How
Uh,
many were there, and how young were they?
there was 1,200 guardsmen on campus in that particular operation. Not as, I mean, that's kind of a myth that they were the same age as the students. That's not true. They were older. There were some who were young, 20, 21, but the guys who opened fire were all in their late 20s and early 30s. So no.
Were the
Um,
younger ones in one group of one company, and the older ones in another company?
the company that opened fire, that fired into the crowd, a company called G Troop, part of the 107th Armored Cavalry. They were all older and angrier.
27.5 average, you say?
Yeah, they were, and several of them were mid-30s. I mean, it was so. I mean, these were not kids, and their motivations are known only to them. There's a element of malevolence in that group that it was not present in some of the other guardsmen. As one of the guardsmen I did talk to said, I think very profoundly, he said, you know, those bastards, they drag the rest of the bus, the rest of us under the bus with them. So, I mean, you know, there was not, the rest of the guard was not, I mean, they did not think as one, you know, they were pretty upset about what happened to a lot of
Now,
people.
also, they had been in the Huff riots
Hmm.
sometime before
Hmm.
in Cleveland in
And the
66.
Glenville riots, yeah, the Glenville, yeah.
And was that, I mean, that, now that's also the trucker strike. Let's get to that too. But the Huff race riots had to have an effect on them as background tensions that they were there. And then they went right into the trucker strike, which you see here. I'll show you that on pages 2 and 3 here. And here they are during that area where they were protecting the scabs, I guess. Is that what
Yep,
they were
they
doing?
sure were. Yeah, that
And,
was
and that
it
was
was
a
a
mixed lot of political people,
yeah,
and they were
right.
tired and emotionally spent. This was just before they went off to Kent.
Yeah, hours before. Yeah. No, that was a hairy operation. I mean, the Teamsters in 1970 meant business, you know, and those guys were all armed and they were, most of them were veterans and they were no nonsense. I mean, and there was some gunfire. They were shooting at the scabs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a hairy operation. And the guardsmen who were, you know, not really trained for that were pretty much petrified during the whole thing. So moving to Kent, then they were already all ramped up and paranoid. Yeah, played a big part.
Now, by the way, I did see a product placement, something you've already talked about,
Oh,
and
Mad.
that's with you in Mad Magazine.
Right. Sure.
And you said that that did have an impact on you. What about your home at that time? You were 10.
Hmm.
Uh, what was your home? Were they politically active, your parents, or
Not particular.
aware?
Well, my dad was actually in local government. I mean, you know, he was a chemist by day, and then I think he was on the town council at that point or something. But he was very moderate. They never talked about politics, very, very seldom. So it was not really part of my upbringing. No, it was
I'm
a
going to
happy
get
home.
I'm going to get, our regular viewers know that being an antiquarian shop, especially, we have artifacts for most of the books that come in. This is a little different for us being a 20th century like this.
Hmm.
20, and so I wanted to show you an artifact that I found. Well, there are two artifacts that I'm going to show. One, myself. I was back there at that time. So I think I'm an artifact of that period. I was in college when Kent State took place. And in fact, I found, strangely enough, my notice of classification as 1A
Wow.
in the draft. And so I thought I would show that right now.
What was your
But I
number? Do you
was,
remember?
hmm?
Do you remember your draft number?
You don't ever forget a draft number. 82.
Ooh, that's low.
You got it. It just, whoa,
Yike.
right on my face.
So you went to
But
grad school for like 10 years to
well, it's an interesting story, but this is your book. We won't get into that. Another time over a beer, I'll tell
right.
you that one. But uh, I was Martin Luther King's in 68. King's murder was on my birthday.
Mm.
And Robert Kennedy's murder was soon after that. And then the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago in 68, I was here present at the Battle of Balboa. I've been in the Hilton with the McCarthy campaign, actually, on the finance part. And then in 1970, this book really hit me, Derf, because I was here in Chicago when it occurred, and I was just going back to NYU in New York. And I went there, and I'll never forget getting back into Manhattan. I felt like I was in an occupied country. That's how I felt right then. It was not my country, and it was occupied. And I was at NYU at Washington Square. So when you reference the hard hats at University Place, that beautiful one block, bucolic block near Washington Square. And I was right near there when the hard hats were going through, smashing up on May 8th, 1970, all the students. And then I walked by on my way to campus every day. I walked right down Fifth Avenue, past 11th Street, where the weatherman,
The
Terry
townhouse.
Robbins, and you
Yeah.
talk about him in your notes,
Sure.
blew himself up. And here's the question I wanted to ask. It was only 4 blocks from University Place. All this was happening. But you report in your notes that next door was Dustin Hoffman.
Yeah.
I remember it, that it was Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft who lived 2 houses down.
I think you're right there. I think they did live 2 houses down. Yeah. But
So did
Dustin lived
Hoffman
right next
also live
door.
there?
Yeah. Dustin
Yeah,
lived right
so
next
that's
door.
who was there, I know.
The wall was his, it blew through his wall. There are photos of him standing and looking at the rubble. Yeah, it was yeah, it was a really fascinating incident. Robbins is a really amazing character. He's one of the founders of the Kent State SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and then became one of the founders of the Weathermen, who pulled off the coup of SDS in Chicago at the National Convention in 1969. And
That's right.
he was a wannabe terrorist, and he blew himself up making bombs, yeah, in the townhouse. But a fascinating individual. I almost, at times, just kind of went down the rabbit hole with him and kind of regret not doing a book about Terry Robbins, because very little's known about him, but he's really an interesting character.
Yeah, and became known to us because of that bombing, because I sat there and watched that the day of. Now let's get to Kent State, because this is what this book is about. Now I was at Indiana University, which was an island in a conservative community. And, you know, as campus versus the townies, you call it town versus gown. Was there a disconnect between the campus of Kent State and the surrounding community?
Oh, profound.
And did the guardsmen themselves, many of them, come from the community
Yes.
around it?
Yes, they did. Most of the guardsmen were from small towns or rural Ohio. Very few were from the cities. Most of the kids at Kent State were from the cities. So Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, predominantly. So, which were, you know, at that time, Cleveland was, I don't know, 2 million people. So, I mean, it was a very different, and there was a disconnect, of course, the culture disconnect between the youth of 1970 and mainstream America, which was really extreme at that time, maybe more extreme than it has been at any point in our history. You can't really overplay that. And the suspicion, particularly by mainstream America toward those students, was just at a fever pitch. I mean, it's kind of what we're seeing now with Antifa. And, you know, that kind of just paranoid delusion and just outright hatred and distrust. I mean, it's like we've circled back around to 1970, which is absolutely
and we felt it.
One of the worst years we've ever had. I mean, we do not want to relive 1970, but here we are.
It seems that we are. Now, I was going to show you on page 81 real fast. I'll do what you're asking. I had the proof ready to go, but I know this is theater, but this is probably how the guardsmen viewed the campus people, probably, even though this was theater. This is nonetheless how they probably saw it.
Yeah.
And of course, the guardsmen, let's see, what page was that? 95. They probably looked like this to the campus near the end.
Right.
And that's probably how they felt inside themselves as well. So what was the campus like prior to May 4th? What was the unrest? ROTC, certainly, like many campuses, was under siege and was burned. I'll show that while you're talking. And SDS and the Weathermen were there. Talk about both of those, please, and the unrest that was there.
There was some. Kent was not particularly a radically violent campus overall. I would say that Ohio State was certainly much worse, and it was much larger. Ohio University, which is in the south of the state, was worse. I would put Kent somewhere in the middle. They did have a small but very active SDS, and because of their proximity to Cleveland, where there was a lot of SDS activity, and Cleveland was a weatherman stronghold for a variety of reasons. So because of that, the Kent SDS was very active and very radical, but it was small. So the threat was greatly inflated. The few days right before the shootings were very contentious because of
Now, here it is burned down,
right. That's the
ROTC,
ROTC building. Yeah,
and being guarded by the National Guard.
yeah.
Uh, the one before this, if you can go back to that, Bjorn, I wanted to ask you about the significance of the bell, because that's going to have significance a little later in the story, but you
Right.
put it front and center right here.
Yeah. Well, it's a campus landmark. So, and the bell, the pealing bell, that clang, it really encapsulates May 4, what happened. I mean, when you see the news footage, you can hear the bell in the background. And every year at the commemoration, at the moment of the shootings, at 12:20, I believe, they ring the bell in memory of the students who were shot. So, I mean, it's very much a part of uh, very much, I wouldn't call it an artifact because it's still there, but it's very much a part of what happened on May 4. I mean, it's the one sound that people remember, the bell, and then that horrible salvo when the guard opened fire. Those are the two sounds that really resonate with the people who were there.
Talking about SDS and the weathermen who were there and had cells there, as many places, and you might want to talk about it later, how they weren't there on May 4th.
No, they weren't. Yeah.
But I thought I remember, now this is a while ago and could be faulty, but I kind of remember that Kent State, when I was in college, was being touted as more than just a local institution. And they were trying to get people from out of state
Hmm.
to come in
Oh,
and
yeah.
be there. And I thought that they were getting the numbers of them.
They were. Yeah, they were. That's correct. Your memory's correct. They particularly recruited in New York. They had a large contingent of Long Islanders, for example, because they recruited in Long Island high schools. For example, Jeffrey Miller, the whose body is in the famous photo, he was from Long Island. So yeah, that's very true. Kent State in 1960, let's see, in 1960, it was a campus of 6,000 students and about 35 buildings. By 1970, it was a campus of 21,000 students and over 100 buildings. I'm not aware of any other college in the country that grew that fast, that quickly, that much, that quickly. So it was really kind of an astounding growth. And, there were some growing pains that came with that. I mean, you could place that wherever you want. You could place it on the times, the changing attitudes of youth, or, there's a lot of factors that go into it. But I think it kind of got out of hand. I mean, they kind of lost control of the situation because of that rapid growth.
Tell us I'm going to get to some of the personalities
Hmm.
that are in the book. But before we go there, tell us about what you call the tipping point, May 3rd, the evening of May 3rd, and how and when were the guardsmen called in, and what was also Operation Chaos that was in the background of all
Wow, that's a
this.
broad question.
And yeah, and you say that it was still classified, and I wonder why the Freedom of Information Act can't get to it. But
Because Congress gave them an exemption from the Freedom of Information Act, because the director of the CIA went before them and said, look, if the American people knew all the details of Operation Chaos, which was a subversive program that ran from like 65 to 80, something like that, maybe a little earlier than that, and was exposed by Seymour Hersh, the famous journalist from the New York Times. Because if the American people knew all the details, it would spell the end of the CIA. This
Because
is the
they're not supposed to
director of the
be,
CIA
they're
saying,
not supposed to be inside the country. They're supposed to be
right.
outside the country.
No, it was flagrantly in violation of their charter. Yeah, and it was sweeping. A lot of people know about Cointelpro, which was the FBI's similar program, and that resulted in house cleaning at the FBI and great reforms, which were eventually overturned by Reagan. But the CIA was as bad, if not worse, and included everything from illegal wiretaps, beating people up, smear campaigns, all the way up to,
Whom did it
physically hurting
start with?
people.
Is under Johnson or Nixon?
It was under Johnson. Yeah.
Huh.
Johnson
Sad to
was
hear
no
that.
fan of the anti-war movement, as you may recall.
I remember.
Yeah. So he was little better than Nixon, though he wasn't quite as flagrantly illegal as Nixon was.
Yeah, right.
So the Guard came
So the
in.
guardsmen, when did the guardsmen then, why were they called in and when?
Well, the Guardsmen were called in because the governor of Ohio was trying to win an election. There was a primary election scheduled to take place on Tuesday, May 5th. And the governor was trailing his opponent for a Republican nomination for an open Senate seat. And he was desperate to make up ground, and he was looking to pander to his base. So the number one boogeyman in 1970 was unruly student radicals.
Yeah,
And
right.
so that's why the Guard was dispatched. It had nothing to do really with, there was there was some window smashing on Friday night, downtown Kent, that got out of hand. And that was the excuse that they used. The local officials panicked, but the governor was just thrilled to have this drop in his lap. So he sent the Guard in force with orders to crack heads, and he didn't care if they were innocent or guilty or who they were. And you're talking about, I don't know, 500 kids maybe in downtown Kent who, went on a bit of a rampage, and 21,000 students on campus, and yet everybody was guilty. The tipping point on Sunday night was a lot of students that were fed up with this military occupation and all these checkpoints and curfews, and because they'd done nothing. I mean, very rightly, it's like, what the hell did we do? We were in our dorms, we were studying, we're sick of this. So they marched onto Main Street and had a sit-in and demanded an end to the occupation and end to the curfew and everything. And the Guard, instead of ratcheting down tensions, decided instead to attack. And it was brutal. And there were a dozen kids who were bayoneted, and many were beaten. A lot of people were gassed. And it was a pivotal moment because at that point, there was no going back. And the next day, the students were furious. The Guard was pissed off. And there would be no peace at that point. So yeah, that was a crucial moment.
Derf, we're going to get to Bjorn right now, but because of that last picture, you showed an artifact, an original bayonet.
Oh.
You would show that to our viewers, please.
Sure.
We just saw that, and that's one of those original bayonets that were in front of the kids.
It's a fearsome weapon. I mean, if I had this on the end of an M1, which is I could shove it right through this outside wall next to me and it would go clean through. I mean, it is a fearsome weapon and razor sharp. But I use it because it's so difficult to draw these things in perspective. So I would just hold it in front of me and look at the angle so I could effectively draw it. And the other one I had here was my gas mask. This is a Vietnam era gas mask, because I wanted to get an idea of what it was like for the Guardsmen to be wearing these things on a hot day, which it was hot on May 4th. And
Well,
they
you
complained.
mentioned that in here, that they could speak and see fairly well still.
Yeah, well, if you didn't wear glasses. If you wore glasses, you had to take your glasses off, so you were nearly blind. And they leaked. They were not, they didn't keep out the gas. And they're uncomfortable. I mean, I actually mowed my lawn wearing this just to get an idea of what it would be like to march around with a gas mask on. And it's not particularly comfortable. But yeah, I mean, that's the lengths you go to, to be accurate.
Bjorn, you have something to say here.
Yeah, I'm going to chip in a little bit here because I want to catch you up on what's happening on our Facebook feed, and I want to thank everybody that is watching via Facebook on the live stream. And I sort of figured things would work this way when we got into this conversation. Gentlemen, we don't really have anybody asking any questions, but everybody seems to have something to say.
Oh.
And of course, this is because this is a topic that everybody has an opinion about or a memory about if they're a certain age. And I was alive, but I don't have a memory about it. But for instance, Chad Combs has read it, and he wanted to chime in and said that he'd read Kent State for Dead in Ohio. Says it's outstanding and very sad and a must read for all. Thank you, Chad. David Wiegers has, from here in Chicago, has made a couple of comments. First, that it was simply a turning point for him and his generation. And then he admits, and I thank you, David, for being, very honest here. David says, my dad and I had a terrible fight on the night of the police riot at the Democratic National Convention. And that is, that doesn't send a question out to you, Derf, but it does, maybe I'll just say, to what extent was all of this, whether you go Kent State or Jackson State or my alma mater, the University of Kansas, which that occurred in July of 1970, to what extent was this a generational conflict and national
Oh, sure, absolutely, absolutely. And it's a period covering roughly, I don't know, 5 years. The Chicago 68 was, I would say, the climax of it, the peak. And Kent State was the bloody finale, because after Kent State, the air really just kind of went right out of the anti-war movement. I mean, we had a couple more large events in '71. Oh, actually, the May Day tribe, which was to remember Kent State, but that was really about the last huge uh, um, protest. I mean, everyone was expecting that the protests would continue into fall 1970. It would be a country in flames, and that in fact did not happen. I think a lot of people of that age felt, I know my draft number. I'm not going to get, I'm not going to get drafted. The call-ups are winding down. Do I really want to die for this cause? Nah, not really. I mean, there was a definite hesitancy to really throw their lives, um, put their lives on the line again after that. I mean, it had a chilling effect, which is exactly what the authorities hoped would happen.
Yeah.
So,
You mentioned it at one point in the book. We talked about that before. Hey, someone did actually say, oh, I have a question. I have a question. So Chuck Cubison has a question. He says, okay, a question. What do you think of the Michener's book?
Michener's book is a really interesting period piece. It He's desperately looking for a vast left-wing student conspiracy that is just not there. And so he goes to great lengths to kind of conjure that up. But the student radicals in Kent State, most of them had split. A lot of them were thrown in jail. The rest all left town because it just got too hot. And there weren't that many of them anyways. Maybe, I don't know, the leadership at SDS in Kent was maybe 40 people. And there are a couple hundred others who were supporters, but most of them left town just because it got too hot, especially when the guard moved in. That's when everybody split. So yeah, there was Michener's book is. I mean, you read it and you just kept going, "Oh man, what are you looking for here?" And it
All right,
doesn't
guys,
hold up very
I'm
well.
gonna jump out, and if anybody asks another question that just demands our attention, I'll come back. But
Okay.
see you again soon.
All right.
Well, I want to show a map of the campus. This is what the plan was
Right.
for the guards to go into campus and uh, get the crowds away.
Right.
Many of them, as you say, were students. They weren't there throwing anything, at least at the
Well,
time.
sure. Yeah. Keep in mind that was the noon class break, and the campus was open because the governor refused to close the campus, so that would be giving in to the radicals. So, I mean, if you've been in a large university at the noon class break, you know what that's like. I mean, it's just every building on campus empties. And they were all massed around the commons there because they wanted to see what was going to happen. There were maybe 400 kids protesting around the Victory Bell. There were 200 guardsmen on the guard line there at the bottom of that page. And it was just kind of a spectacle. And into that, the guard marched and fired tear gas, and they gassed everybody, and they chased everybody. And there were probably 7,000 kids on that hillside around Taylor Hall. It was just a total debacle, and with tragic consequences.
This is a little bit later when they were in the athletic field.
Right.
And this is when things began to go downhill. And some of them, Company G, left there and went to another area where they shouldn't have done. Let's do this. I want to get to some of the denouement as well and show a couple of more illustrations out of here and certainly get to the moment itself, although we started out with it. But give us briefly, let's talk about some of the players that were there, some of the protagonists that were there. You certainly, first part of the book, you give the lives of those 4 that were killed: Jeff Miller,
Right.
Sandy Scheuer, Bill Schroeder, Allison Cruz.
Krause.
And then there were 9 others that were wounded.
Right.
And you tell all of them about you talk about their lives and whom they were and humanize them, because we've only known them in statistics.
Exactly. Exactly. That was my idea when approaching the book. You know, at the beginning, when you do a book, you sit down as an author and think, okay, what's my book about? You know, and there have been a lot of books about Kent State, but there's never really been one that followed the lives of those 4 individuals who were such typical kids. I mean, they were remarkable kids in many ways, but they were just so typical. It's so young. I mean, 2 of them were just 19 years old. And I thought my idea was, oh, I'm going to put the reader on the ground with these kids, and you're going to walk beside them over the course of these 4 days. And even if it's just silly, like, you know, playing drums with Jeff Miller, or, you know, walking to class with Sandy, or taking photos around campus with Bill, you're going to follow those kids and see what they're like. And I think it really humanizes this story and makes it very personal. And we get to know them, and we get to, you know, understand what their motivations were and their fears and their dreams. And then when they're cut down, it packs a wallop, because we know them. So that was my idea from the beginning, and I'm pretty happy with the way that turned out.
Yeah, positively, because when that started to happen, and all of a sudden we're here. I'm showing you the proof. I'm sorry, it's not as nice an image, but I want to get to it.
Right.
And as you say, since we knew them,
Right.
this was really shocking.
Yeah.
And even for me, and I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And
Well,
as I was
one
reading
thing,
and
you know,
getting to it, all of a sudden, it really came about that I felt for them as individuals.
Right. I mean, that's the power of comics and the power of visual narrative, because it's one thing to read about, you know, Allison was shot in the side as she was diving for cover, as you see in this panel. It's another thing to see it. A young girl hit in the side and you know, die on an asphalt parking lot. That's a shocking image, and so that is the power of my art form, and I think that's why this particular book has that impact.
Talk to us again. These are kind of brief little tidbits of who they were. Talk to us about Robert Canterbury, the general.
Oh, Canterbury, yeah. Canterbury was
really a mess there. And Sylvester Del Corso, the adjutant general of the guards.
Right.
Please talk with me about them. I'm going to show you Canterbury as you speak.
Canterbury was the second in command of the National Guard. Del Corso was his superior. He was the commander in chief. And Del Corso was basically a politician. He was a real hard ass. He had a deep antipathy toward the anti-war movement. He thought they were all communists. He wanted to crack heads. He was a strong Nixon advocate. He was a strong advocate of using military force to crush civilian protest. He was basically a fascist. Canterbury was just a screw up. He was a career desk jockey, had no combat experience, and for some reason, he was put in charge of this operation. And the Scranton report, which was the presidential commission that investigated the shootings that summer, described him, quote unquote, as a disaster. And he was. And it was his blunders that really certainly laid the path for tragedy. Although the actual shooting, you have to put that at the feet of the guardsmen who opened fire themselves. And whatever their motivations were, we still don't know, because they've maintained their silence ever since. And at this point,
Huh?
they're maintaining their silence because they have to. I mean, that's the only excuse that's left to them. We can't talk because we can't talk, because likely it was premeditated murder. And there's no statute of limitations on premeditated murder. So they just don't want to talk, and they probably never will. So we'll never have that closure.
Frank Karlovich,
Hmm.
uh, he was a guardsman. It's a pseudonym
Hmm.
because he was anonymous
Hmm.
in the report. How did you find out who he was? And how did you get him to open up a little bit? And also, why did you believe him?
Well, his account is very blunt. I mean, you can tell uh, when you hear something like that, what if they're being truthful or not. He's a bit of a braggart, I think, a bit of a hard ass. He went into a career in law enforcement, actually, and I think that he believes that he comes across a little better than he does when he's, very bluntly describing a colleague, bayoneting a young girl in the back twice. Um, but no, his account had the ring of truth. He does lie at the end. He lies about shooting, as most of them do. But I was able to compare and contrast to the FBI report, which is like some 10,000 pages. Compare and contrast to the news reports and the Scranton report, and I could. It wasn't, it's not hard to figure out who fired and who didn't. I mean, they listed. So I didn't really feel it necessary to call him out on that, because I was grateful to have that account. So because it's the only one, the only one available. So it's kind of a juggling act, but I thought it was important to have that experience, as I said earlier, the experience of what these guardsmen were also going through, because it's part of the story. Not because I'm taking their side, not because I believe both sides should be prevented. I mean, one side had guns and the other side did not. So, you know, it's not a balanced conflict there. But I thought it was an interesting experience to have, and I was grateful to have it.
I spoke about or at least mentioned the Scranton Commission. Just a few miles away from here was the Battle of Balboa, which I mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
in front of the Hilton. And the Kerner Commission came out and called that a police riot.
Right.
And I believe it. I saw it. Now, Mayor Daley famously said, people may have forgotten this, famously said, the police ain't here to create disorder, they're here to preserve disorder.
Yeah,
It
right.
should be up on some wall somewhere, but that's
Yeah.
exactly what he said. So did the Scranton Commission call this a National Guard riot?
No, they didn't, but they certainly said that the shootings were unjustified and unexplainable. I mean, I believe that's a direct quote. They put the blame pretty squarely on the governor and his top generals, and they skirted some stuff. I mean, remember, this was a Nixon commission, so Nixon was playing Nixonian politics here. He wanted to pretend to make it seem as if he was being fair and even-handed, when really he was more worried about his political machinations. But it was a remarkably blunt report. The FBI report is even more blunt. It basically comes out and calls the guardsmen who they interviewed liars, because so many of them wouldn't admit to shooting. They said they reloaded their clips, they ditched their guns, they all within minutes of the shooting. And from my perspective, this is not how innocent people behave, right? Because the best defense is always the truth. If you lie, there's a reason you're lying.
Since you mentioned that man, or that other man, the proof, when I was reading when I got your publisher's proof first, it didn't end with this one-page epilogue.
Right.
That I was surprised when I got to the end of the book when it came in. And there we are, whoops, there we are. Richard Nixon in the Oval Office.
Yeah, gloating about Kent State. Yeah, that
And
was.
So what was he saying about, because he quoted Kent State.
Right. Yeah, he was actually at that time he was gloating about a prison riot, the Attica prison riot, which ended in bloodshed as well. And he hoped it would have a salutary effect on future prison riots, as Kent State had on the student anti-war movement. And that comes from a Nixon tape, which was uncovered at the behest of Bob Woodward, the famous journalist.
Was this a last minute? Why wasn't it in the proof? Was this last moment that it was put into
I
the
think
book?
my editor wanted to leave it out, actually. Just as kind of a surprise for the final book. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a great
terrific.
walk-off.
Yeah, terrific. It's great. Now, the campus riots occurred throughout the nation after this, after Kent.
450 campuses closed, yeah.
But there were also, as you were saying, there was a large number in the nation that also felt that the students had it coming.
Very much so, yeah. 58%
And so,
of the 58% of the Gallup poll said the students were to blame for being shot at Kent State.
58%.
Yeah.
There was a random fact in here that I loved. I'm just going to say it. There were a number of random facts, but one of them was that the Beatles album, Let It Be, was released just 4 days later on May 8th.
Right.
Just puts it into, I remember when that came out and the whole thing at the same time. Let It Be, right after Kent State.
Right.
That was hard.
I'll bet.
Lovely music.
I'll bet.
That was hard.
Yeah, it was probably, your experience was probably a lot different than mine because, I'm younger. I was only 10. Because you saw all of this kind of grow and expand, where from my perspective, there had always been student unrest. There had always been a war in Vietnam. There had always been cities in flames, because I don't remember a time when those things didn't exist. So it was a different experience for me. Certainly the Kent State shootings really resonated with me for some reason. It really hit home. Even at that
you were
young
right
age.
there. There are people in the community, the students, the guardsmen came from you.
Yeah. And I knew kids in my town went to Kent State. And in my life, I've known so many people that went to Kent. I didn't go to Kent State because of the shootings.
No.
10 years later, I was picking a college and I just thought, oh man, do I want to deal with this? Because there were big protests there taking place at that time. They were building a gym on part of the shooting site, and there were huge protests and all these people were dragged off. And I just thought, nah, I'll go to Ohio State instead.
I have a couple of more things I want to ask, if I may.
Sure.
Bjorn, you want to get in first?
I'm just going to chime in really quick and I'm glad you just made that question, Derf, because the comment I have is from one of our previous questioners, Chuck Cubison, and Chuck says, I was a student at Kent in the early 80s, and May 4th cast a long shadow on KSU in many ways. And so I had to jump in and share what Chuck said, because that's exactly what you said, Derf. It cast a shadow over you, and you decided to go to Ohio State.
It's still there. It's still present. The campus has a palpable sadness about it. It's a wonderful state school, and I love the campus and I love the town, but and people who go there really seem very fond of it. But there's something different about Kent. Yeah, it's still there.
Does it look much the same? Does the shooting ground look the same?
The shooting ground is a national historic site now. So yeah, it's been preserved. Yeah, it pretty much looks the same, except for that damn gym, which was built over the practice field.
Yeah.
For years, the university tried to bury the shooting, but lately they've really embraced it as history and as a teaching tool. So yeah,
Yeah.
no, they've changed their attitudes about it. It's quite moving to go there.
What misconceptions did you find in your research, or anything that surprised you?
Anything that surprised? Well, there were a few small things about the four. Yeah, there were a lot of surprises there. I don't want to give them all away.
No,
I
let
have
them
some.
read the book.
Right, right. I have some things that other people don't have, and indeed surprised some of the family members too. Um, no, there wasn't. I mean, I had a pretty clear idea of what the story was because I've followed this history for a long time. It's always been a fascination of mine. When you grow up near Kent, it's kind of part of your DNA. Um, if you're of a particular age, so there weren't a lot of surprises. No,
Okay.
no.
I've always wanted to interview an author only from the author's notes and footnotes, not from the book itself. I've always,
Okay,
and this is a perfect book for
it
that,
is.
except
Hit
the
me.
illustrations took me away from that. The ending has innumerable notes that I'm
Right.
telling you, viewers, are necessary to read after you've gone through the book. There's so much there, so much that will give you then background of things that you've all of a sudden emotionally felt. And you may come to different conclusions, maybe not, because there's some areas where you're not so sure. But it's fascinating to read all those page after page after page.
Thank you.
I loved reading that, and I think it's essential to this book.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, there's still a lot of argument over certain parts of the story,
There are
and
ambiguities, positively.
sure, there's ambiguities as well. But you can disagree with my conclusions, but there's the source right there in the footnotes. Literally panel by panel.
There's one
And
that kind of, yes, it is, positively.
right.
And something that kind of hit me in a way from the other side, trying to think of the guardsmen themselves.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm not trying to justify, but maybe understand parts of them.
Right.
The rage that was going on in the 60s was there and palpable, and that uh, town gown positively was there, hippie worker positively was there, and it was palpable, it was ugly, and
It
you could
was
see it.
ugly.
But sniper at the Huff riots that we started out with,
Hmm.
there were some snipers there.
Yeah, there were a couple.
And so I could see, but there were no snipers that were found at Kent State, even though guardsmen said there were.
Hmm.
Yet I could see them coming in with a unconscious mindset that if there are snipers at the Huff riots, there
Yeah,
certainly could be snipers here at Kent
absolutely.
because of SDS, Weathermen, because we hate them, whatever.
Right.
So that's another part of we need to understand from their point of view.
Well, but that
That,
was sure, but
I
that
mean,
was a false rumor. I mean, there were no snipers at Chicago '68. The weathermen were not shooting at people. I mean, they planted bombs, but they weren't shooting at people. There was absolutely no instance of, police or guardsmen being fired on by anti-war radicals. It didn't happen in the previous 3 or 4 or 5 years. I mean, it just was not a thing. So that was a failure of leadership more than anything. And it was really the guard officers who didn't nip that sort of thing in the bud and, in fact, fed it, that it just kept ramping up these fears and this paranoia to a fever pitch until it burst.
well, it's impossible. This is my last question because we've run out of time.
Mm,
But it's impossible not to think of today. As we
absolutely.
started out, we've come
Yeah,
around full circle. It's impossible not to think of today.
right. I knew this book.
And it's reflection. We're a reflection of back then as well,
Yeah,
except it's not on campuses, on the city streets.
right.
So are there any lessons? What lessons would you tell us that might come from this book?
Well, the lessons are, I think the lesson is one that we are seeing played out today. I mean, I don't think any of the protesters on the streets over the course of this past year have any illusion that they could be shot. In 1970, the protesters at Kent State, they didn't even think the guard had loaded guns. They didn't dream they were in any danger until that salvo, until they actually opened fire and they saw people fall around them. I mean, even as people were falling, there were some students yelling out, "They're only blanks, don't worry." I don't think anybody today has that illusion, and that's the lasting legacy of Kent State. That the authorities, if you really threaten the authority, truly threaten their power, their response can be lethal. And I think that's something we carry around with us.
Derf, thanks you so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us. I've enjoyed this immensely. It was down memory lane and brought up a great deal besides my 1A classification. So thank you for being here. We appreciate this. Was a wonderful book. I truly think everyone should get this. It's a great read, and the illustrations are fabulous.
Thank
and
you.
will be emotional and take you right along. Bjorn, would you take us out?
Sure. And again, thank you, Derf, for joining us today. And I do want to let everybody know that our first edition copies of Kent State, For Dead in Ohio, will be available to be ordered at alincolnbookshop.com. I don't care where you're watching this, whether it's Facebook Live or the YouTube channel, we are going to give you a link to go to the order page. You order it, we will send it to you with the author's signature. Again, we thank you for signing the book plates, Derf. And I am not going to ask one last question. I am simply going to say one thing that we're not going to talk about, which is the existence of the imagery and the iconography of Kent State in American culture. If we opened up that rabbit hole, we would go for another couple of hours. But I think we will finish our program here with the image that we have all seen so many times, and that this is really what we think of in that horrific last moment of Kent State. The image of screaming and death.
Bjorn, breaking news before we leave.
Yeah.
Anyone in our area? I got this note put on my desk just now.
2020.
So
Yeah.
anyone who's around our area just know.
Boy, that just sums it up, doesn't it?
Sums up. Hey, everybody, thank you for joining us. And this has been House Divided, and we will see you next time.